Hello. I'm hoping all the recording is going to work and that you can hear me loud and clear. The title of my talk is Land Cover Dependent Relationships Between Fire and Soil Moisture. And this is work that we published in the journal Fire in 2019 at the link in the middle of the slide. And my name is Brian Magi. I'm an associate professor of atmospheric sciences at UNC Charlotte in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. And my PhD student, Alex Schaefer, is also in the same department. And it has led most of this work. So I'm presenting more or less his work. Of course, I'm working closely with him on the project, but I do thank you to all the organizers for the invitation to talk about that. So we drew inspiration from, let's see, can I move this? Yes. We drew inspiration from this publication, Krawchuk and Moritz in Ecology, which is called Constraints on Global Fire Activity Vary Across Resource Gradients. And I reproduced a graph that they had in a much more simplified way. So go to their paper to actually see the more nuanced explanations. But what we're trying to show in this phase space is fire activity ranging from low to high on the vertical axis, and biomass availability or the resource availability ranging from biomass poor to biomass rich. And Alex and I wanted to take advantage of the increasingly widely available soil moisture data sets that are not only available regionally, but available globally as well, and ask the question of whether soil moisture could serve as a proxy for biomass availability and condition. Namely, we look to the resource limit on the left side of the phase space, and this is the limit where if we have such perennially low soil moisture values that it's no longer able to support the biomass that is needed for fire to burn. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum is the climate limit. So this is the climate resource limit that was referred to in Krawchuk and Moritz and that we're going to allude to. In the climate limit, this is where soil moisture values are high, and they produce plenty of biomass, so plenty of fuel to burn, but the fuel itself is conditioned in such a way that the moisture content will prevent most fire from ever happening. Now, the data sets we're going to bring to bear on this question are the MODIS C6 fire accounts data set, which you can find at the University of Maryland website, another University of Maryland website, the Land Use Harmonization Land Cover data set, which we break into 4 different land cover types that we'll look at more closely over the rest of this talk: forest, grass, pasture, and crop. And then a static biome map from a paper by Levavasseur et al. 2012, who looked at global potential vegetation distribution, and we aggregated their biomes into 4 super biomes: boreal, grassland, savanna, temperate, and tropical. And finally, the soil moisture data set, that we used was the European Space Agency version 4.2 data set, representing the top 5 centimeters in a spatially incomplete global data set, meaning that there are data gaps where the satellite retrievals are unable to capture soil moisture. The data sets we used the data sets for years 2000 to 2014, so we brought about 15 years of data to bear on this. If we look at the annual mean fire counts around the world and then break it into the 4 biomes that we use, the boreal biome is on the top left. You can see fires distributed throughout the boreal biome, but not intruding on the tundra, the wettest part of the boreal biome, quite as intensely yet. Of course, that's changing right now as the tundra begins to dry out, or green up, as we say in the Arctic. Also, on the top right of each of these subplots are the number of fires that are occurring within each biome. So you can see which biomes dominate overall annual mean fire counts, at least according to the MODIS data set. And we look to the grassland savanna biome, and we can see that roughly about 2 million fires occur there every single year. The Western United States includes is a grassland savanna biome for the most part in the way that we've designated it. But you can also see that much of the continent of Africa is labeled as a grassland savanna biome, and this is where most of the fires in the world occur every year. About half of the fires in the world, in fact. So it is the continent that burns the most every single year. Temperate biome is another little blip in Africa, but also Eastern United States, Europe, and parts of southeastern Brazil. And that accounts for another 1 million fires. And then about 1 million fires occur in the peripheries of the tropical rainforest as deforestation commences along the edges of the Congo and the Amazon rainforest. And that these fires are detectable by MODIS. Sorry, this will Thing is right in the way, isn't it? All right, so this is where the fires are. This is how it looks in terms of the biome space. What are we going to do with it? So what Alex and I wanted to do was to build what we call fire soil moisture curves, and study the the resource availability space in terms of soil moisture relative to the fire space, and using MODIS fire counts as a proxy for something like fire danger, not necessarily perfectly predictive for fire counts, but maybe better predictive for fire danger. And we wanted to break this into a spatial study where we looked across biomes and land cover types within those biomes to see what the dependencies were, and explore fundamentally whether there is a resource limit and climate limit apparent in this phase space, and then how it varies from biome to biome and land cover type to land cover type. The question we really are trying to get at, we were pretty confident that the semi-natural fire regimes on forest and grassland cover types would be relatively straightforward. But what we were hoping was to get at fire soil moisture curves that allowed for predictability on landscapes that include prescribed or intentional fires, like the top pictures here on either side. And that was a bit of a reach, because we weren't sure if we had enough data to support it, or whether human agency would really play out relative to soil moisture. Kind of a fundamental question that would be, do the people that light these fires, or these fires over here in Kansas, these are the fires in Ivory Coast of North Africa, are they paying attention to soil moisture in such a regular way that it becomes somewhat predictable, similar to perhaps a lightning triggered fire season that might occur in the interior Alaska, like in the middle picture. To break the world into land cover types, we don't have perfect representations of where the fire is occurring within each grid cell of the world. So we used a threshold determination to find where a particular land cover type dominated in the biome, and then used only those grid cells that were dominated as a part of our analysis. So as we look through the biomes, this is the boreal biome, and these are the 4 land cover types that we studied: grass, forest, pasture, and cropland from left to right. And you can see the boreal biome is largely dominated by grasses and forests, so the tundra versus the boreal forest shield, as expected. And the red represents, in each of the maps, represents where in the world that there is, first of all, boreal biome, but then where it's also dominated by 75% or more of that particular land cover type. And Alex and I felt that this was enough of a threshold that we could say that any fire that occurs within that grid cell would be occurring on that particular land cover type, probability-wise. So it's a soft assumption, but we think it plays out pretty well. And we tested the sensitivity relative to some of the land cover types as well. So grassland savanna biome is dominated by grasses, but not completely, and has a huge component that is pasture as well, as you can see from the red in the 3rd map here. There is some cropland in the grassland savanna biome, as well as forest as well. And then in the temperate biome, we have grasses, forest, pasture, and cropland, but mostly forest. And then I'm looking at the red on the map, of course. And in the tropical biome, it's mostly forest as well. You can see that the heart of the tropical biome is dominated. The only land cover type that really dominates is forest. So what we did was we built fire soil moisture curves for each one of these. So in other words, 16 different fire soil moisture curves, and studied to see whether they have any, see what we could learn. In some cases, we're going to be limited by the amount of data available, as you might suspect. So for example, in the grass land cover type, if we look at the boreal and grassland savanna biomes, which I pointed out with little arrows here, these are the dominant biomes for where grasses occur in the world. You can see that from the amount of red on the maps. Temperate and tropical biomes don't have a prolific amount of grass. Of course, they do have grass land cover type, but not enough to necessarily support a robust fire soil moisture curve analysis as we're doing. In general, though, the global moisture curve, which is the thick green line here, does capture the resource limit and the climate limit fairly well. We can see that they're all the soil moisture curves fire soil moisture curves are similar across biomes, with the exception of the temperate. But the temperate contains this one big blip of fire that occurs in what we could argue as to be perhaps a grassland savanna biome. So it could be a misdiagnosis. We're not sure. There's uncertainty in all 4 of those data sets, which is important to note. But in general, we felt that the grasses were well captured by this fire soil moisture curve, and it played out nicely relative to the Krawchuk and Moritz paper and other papers that stemmed from that. The forest produced an interesting result because we had the global curve shows a much narrower range where fire activity is prominent, and along with the resource limit and climate limit, but the climate limit is much stronger in the sense that even a little bit of soil moisture produces a low probability of fire or a low fire danger, if we want to interpret it that way. However, in the boreal biome, the forests there, which are of course a huge part of the forest in the world's landscapes, also show that they have an extended climate limit, meaning that there is a probability of fire even out to relatively high soil moisture content, which is interesting because it suggests that the fire is never quite off the map in terms of higher amounts of, say, rainfall or soil moisture. Whereas on the other hand, there is still a strong resource limit, but it departs from the overall forest, global forest. And we think this has to do with the shallower root depth of boreal trees that is documented in articles like this in PNAS. And it's remarkable that, in fact, boreal forest trees, the black spruce and others, they seem to have root depths that are more similar to grasses. And in fact, the fire soil moisture curve actually mimics grasses. So if I go back a slide, the grasses, if you watch the thick green curve, let me put my mouse on it, and then you watch the light yellow curve, you can see there's a very similar behavior overall, which introduces some interesting ecological questions about boreal forests' susceptibility to lower soil moisture versus higher soil moisture and how susceptible they are to fire. Pasture, where we were interested in seeing what the result was and we weren't sure what to expect, came out with this global curve, which is the big thick blue line, and it's of course mostly dominated in the pasture is mostly located in the grassland savanna biome, as shown in the maps. And we think that this extended climate limit, where it almost seems like there is no climate limit until you get to the very, very high soil moisture values, perhaps similar to grasses in some ways, but much flatter than grasses in general. And we think that this may reflect something about human agency in controlling the fire season, namely the idea that humans are preempting or avoiding the driest parts of the year when burning pasture that is managed. And we'd have to do more investigation. We have to do further subsetting to really get at this question. But again, the resource limit is quite apparent. As soon as you get to very, very low soil moisture values in places where there's pasture land cover, it pretty much never burns, right? The fire danger decreases to zero because there's no fuel. Cropland has a very strong resource limit as well. All four land cover types do, and a relatively strong climate limit. Although here we're limited to very selected regions of the world. And so Alex and I both felt that this probably requires a more granular study in the sense that we would want to zoom in and really investigate what's happening within a particular part of the world, such as if we took the cropland of the central part of the United States and really just did these analyses for just that part of the world. And maybe others have done this, we're not sure yet. But we did do some sensitivity studies as well to try to get at this question and see whether the result held up, and it did at a global scale, even when we relaxed the threshold that we used to designate the red points on the maps. I'm not going to show that here, but happy to talk about that offline. Soil moisture. The question we asked was, can soil moisture variability be used to understand fire danger relative to both naturally triggered fires and human ignited fires? And we definitely think that's true for fires on semi-natural land cover types. So in other words, is fires that you would expect to happen that would be keyed into soil moisture do seem to have a high degree of fire danger predictability. However, more investigation we think is needed for pastures and cropland, although we do have some tantalizingly interesting results that would suggest that perhaps that higher spatial resolution investigations would allow for a more conclusive result on those land cover types, and maybe get at the question of how do we predict prescribed or intentional fires so that we can maybe model them at larger scales. The current research Alex continues to work on, it includes incorporating SMAP L3 and L4 data, which along with the ESA CCI data that he's been using, to rebuild the fire soil moisture curves for the present day, and perhaps even to the point where we can test the predictability of how well these curves are, or how a fire is predicted, how a fire danger is predicted by soil moisture variability for example, the 2019 and 2020 fire season. So he's working on that. We're also thinking that we need to include at least one additional predictor, and that would be precipitation, to modulate the overall amount of fire that occurs in the wet season or in a very rainy season, for example. Finally, we are wondering, this is the question we're really moving towards, is the idea of whether the NASA SMAP sensor can, with its near real-time data, can be used to, can we use the soil moisture from that to translate into a real-time fire danger index? So that is all I have, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.